Arts and Sciences Teleconferencing Service. In cooperation with Oklahoma State University, presents Teaching English Methods with your host, Dr. Richard Badiger.
Good afternoon. I'm Rick Badiger, Director of Freshman Composition at OSU, and I want to thank you for being here this afternoon after a long day of teaching. We're going to take a look this afternoon at methods of teaching English writing in particular, and I want to begin by pointing to a rather startling contrast between what we say as teachers of writing and about the importance of writing instruction and what we actually do when we get in the classroom. You may remember that in 1975, Newsweek published its now famous issue, Why Johnny Can't Write. And since that time, the quality of writing and writing instruction has received an inordinate amount of attention, testing, research, and debate throughout the United States. Since 1975, we've had a staggering amount of research and opinion about writing and how we should conduct writing instruction. If we read the literature, even casually, we'll discover very quickly that we've gained new insights into why and how we teach writing, and a new respect for writing itself as a complex intellectual activity rather than a mechanical activity. We've come instead to see writing as an important means of learning and discovery and inquiry rather than simply a means of communicating things that we already know. We no longer teach writing as though it were merely a struggle with words, though it is certainly that at some times, or because we believe that it will get our students hired or promoted. We teach writing as a struggle with ideas and information, because writing well empowers our students to shape and influence the world in which they live. Rather than being a service to the so-called content areas, the primary purpose of teaching writing is not to show students that when they write papers in history or science that they will write well, but so that they will be at the center of the liberal arts curriculum and be able to attack and master writing tasks anywhere that they encounter them. Now, we think as a group that we have responded to the Newsweek charges of 1975 and that we've made genuine efforts to improve the quality of writing and writing instruction, and that we've recognized that writing is important. But there are some indications that we haven't. In 1981, 6 years after the Newsweek article, Arthur Appleby of Stanford University published a book, Writing in the Secondary School. It was a careful and rather exhaustive study of how writing is done in the secondary school. Now, Appleby defined writing very broadly. He says that it's any task which requires a student to put pen to paper, and that includes multiple choice exams, true-false exams, fill in the blanks, as well as other writing tasks. Appleby discovered that while 44% of the time that we spend in teaching is devoted to writing activities as he defines them, only 3% of that time is devoted to writing of a paragraph or longer. He did discover, to our advantage, to our benefit, that writing of at least a paragraph in length occurred most frequently in English classes, occupying 10% of the observed time. But he shows that the typical writing assignment reported in a large survey of teachers required less than 1 page of writing. An interesting figure, in light of all the research that we'll talk about and look at some of the results of later, is that the time elapsed between the point that a teacher began an assignment in class and the time that the students were expected to begin writing averaged just over 3 minutes. That's 3 minutes to think about what they want to write about, organize it, and begin producing their papers. 2/3 of the students who mentioned that they were given pre-writing instructions indicated that those instructions were mostly related to form. Where should they put their name? How long should it be? Questions of that sort. And teachers reported that the most frequent response to student writing was to mark errors in mechanics. 71% of them reported that they did that routinely, and 47% said this was one of the most important responses to student writing. These conclusions of Applebee's, especially those involving the amount of time that we devote to writing instruction in class, are sort of startling, especially because they were reached at a time when writing was practically a growth industry in the United States. Today, those of us who teach English and writing are still under pressure to do more and do better. We're still told that we're sending graduates to colleges and out of college, out into the world, unable to write clearly and effectively. And most of us would like nothing better than to help students produce better writing in any assignment that they might encounter. At the same time, as teachers, we know that we'd like to spend fewer evenings and weekends reading that stack of student papers that piles up. The typical high school teacher has 150 students in at least 5 sections, at least 150 students. To read and respond constructively to that amount of writing in any given week takes an inordinate amount of time. And we know that the time and effort that we're spending are sometimes less effective in terms of results than we would like them to be. So my purpose this afternoon is to suggest that we can achieve those apparently contradictory goals. We can both help students write more effectively and spend less time doing it. I won't promise a bag of tricks. I'm assuming that you're all experienced teachers and that you will not be easily impressed by experts, so I'm not going to pose as an expert. And I assume that you are also well past believing that there is such a thing as a bag of tricks in any kind of instruction. Instead, I want to present a version of teaching writing that follows from recent research, one that works for me and works for my students, and one that above all treats students and their writing with a great deal of respect. If you come away from this session with something that will help you in your teaching, or if something I say provokes some healthy discussions about teaching among you and your colleagues, then I think I will have been successful. This afternoon, I've divided the discussion into 3 parts. First, we'll look at what's usually called the writing process. There's been a great deal of research into how students write, how they get their writing done over the past 20 years. And we'll take a look at that phrase and what it means. What is the writing process? How has it affected the way we teach? Next, we'll look at a variety of individual composing processes, components of the writing process, and we'll explore ways of teaching them in class and the reasons for using them. Finally, we'll spend some time with error. The errors we find in student writing catch our attention. They're often the most obvious features of student writing, and they distract our attention from our students' ideas and intentions. We will explore new ways of looking at error and of teaching students to deal with errors. After each segment, you'll have an opportunity to call in questions, and I hope you will do that. Writing instruction in the United States began to develop a research tradition about 20 years ago. And the research into how students write and how we can help them improve their writing has increasingly shifted our attention from written products to the processes or behaviors that students use or writers in general use when they write. We've become less interested in the features of written text, such as the thesis statements, topic sentences, and more interested in how writers produce their text. I think we have a little graphic to show that one. It's become increasingly common to hear other teachers and students on campus and in high schools talk about the writing process. It's almost as though we've discovered something that's brand new. In fact, the writing process has been with us for a long time, and in some way it's always been a factor in writing instruction. For most of this century, teachers and textbooks have presented a particular writing process for students. Usually this consists of advice to choose a subject, make an outline, write a draft, edit carefully, and then turn the paper in. At the same time, students have had their own version of the writing process. They've generally put things off until the last minute. They've written a single draft the night before the due date. They've turned it in and had it returned to them covered with red ink, sometimes for correction, more often with a grade and a general comment written at the end. So when we talk about the writing process, or more precisely, process-oriented instruction, We're not talking about giving students something new, something they have not had all along, as we would be doing if we were teaching them about biology or the Revolutionary War. Rather, to teach the writing process is to attempt to modify their behaviors, the behaviors they've acquired through the years. And we attempt that modification because we believe that process-oriented instruction, as it is generally conceived, is both more effective and more efficient than the processes they're already using. And finally, we hope that it will improve the quality of their writing. What is new about process-oriented instruction, as it's now being presented in professional research and in writing projects in classrooms, and increasingly in textbooks, is that it attempts to teach the writing and composing processes that experienced writers have actually used. Researchers have studied the writing and thinking and problem-solving processes of professional and experienced and inexperienced writers in an attempt to find out how writers actually work, rather than attempting to impose on students processes that have little to do with how people actually do things. This research started to emerge in the 1960s as teachers and researchers reacted against the emphasis on written products that had prevailed in writing instruction for almost a century. In part, their reaction against product-centered instruction arose from informal classroom observations, which led them to conclude that what they'd been doing was not working because it was not leading to improvements in student writing. At the same time, researchers began to examine published writing, and they discovered that much of it did not have the same characteristics of good writing that were outlined in textbooks. As researchers began to study the working methods of experienced writers, they discovered that these methods did not resemble those that were in the textbooks. Teachers and researchers themselves, who were writers themselves, also realized that the methods they and their textbooks were presenting to students bore little relationship to their own working methods. The result of this research into writing processes was to shift our attention from the features of written text to the activities that writers perform as they produce those texts. Instead of looking at written products for their patterns of organization, spelling, grammar, and other features, we began to attempt to study writers' planning, organizing, writing, and revising behaviors so that we could base our instruction on what writers actually do. Based on early research, researchers have constructed what they call models of the writing process. Models are abstract, generalized descriptions of what writers do. And early models of the writing process, we do have a graphic for this one, I believe, indicated that writers generally go through the following tasks in this sequence. It's come to be called a linear stage model writing process, and the advice from teachers and textbooks was that we would first identify a subject. Second, we would identify and analyze a reader. Then we'd gather information, organize, write, revise, edit, and proofread. This particular model of the writing process has sometimes been misinterpreted in several ways, and we shouldn't really accept it without knowing something about what it represents and what it does not represent. To begin with, we have to remember that this is a model, an attempt to represent what writers report that they do and what observers have seen them do. Too often it's been taken as a precise description of the mental processes that writers always perform, rather than as an attempt to understand the processes and behaviors that they're going through. Perhaps the most serious misinterpretation has been that this model represents not what writers in general do or can do, but what all writers should do. Thus, the general model of the writing process has been presented as the writing process, and some teachers and some textbooks have insisted that students perform each of these stages in a specific way in a prescribed sequence. The result has been to replace a rigidity about products with a rigidity about processes, rather than to realize that different writers will have different processes. As research into the writing process became more sophisticated, Researchers realized that the early models, such as we've just seen, linear stage models, did not adequately reflect the complexity of what writers do. Few writers go through the stages of this generalized process, finishing each one before moving on to the next. Instead, researchers have discovered that writers may begin at virtually any point in the process and move from there at will to any other point. If we could look at the desk for a minute, and instead of setting up the stages of this writing process in a straight line, set them up in sort of a circle. I believe this is on page 5 of the outline that you were provided. And we might look at where a writer could begin and the sequence of the activities that a writer would be involved in. Perhaps we do start with a subject, although sometimes it's possible for a writer to start with a reader, somebody in particular he or she wants to reach. Well, what happens next? Sometimes we'll jump right into writing, and as we write, we edit and write and edit and write, but then we discover we need information. Having gotten a little information, we organize, perhaps write again, edit some, revise, write, revise, organize again, back for more information. Well, what is my subject? Perhaps sometimes the subject emerges, so that writing process isn't really linear so much as what researchers have now come to call recursive. Writers can engage in any stage of this process at any time, in any sequence. Researchers have also discovered that just as the process isn't the same for all writers, a single writer may use different processes for different writing tasks or at different times. Depending upon a writer's knowledge of her subject or audience or the complexity of the writing task, an individual writer may abbreviate or avoid altogether some of the steps in the generalized model. For example, a writer who knows subject, audience, and purpose very well may write a first draft that is also a final draft, or may need to spend very little time actually gathering information because he knows it all quite well to begin with. Some of the most informative research and most useful insights that we've come across in looking at writing processes, or the writing process, have come from contrasts between experienced writers and inexperienced writers. Researchers have discovered, for example, that experienced writers spend about 80% of their writing time planning, whereas inexperienced writers do very little planning. Perhaps 20% of their time is actually spent thinking about what they'll write. Experienced writers will delay producing a text until they're ready, whereas inexperienced writers will jump right into a text in order to get the writing started and finished. Experienced writers will write parts of drafts. Inexperienced writers usually work from beginning to end. These contrasts, in fact, this particular chart is also in your outline. I believe it's on page 6 or 7. But we find throughout that there's an enormous difference between how experienced, published, expert, or even senior student writers operate and inexperienced writers operate. Knowing the differences between these two groups should allow us to identify and describe inefficient or unproductive composing processes that students might have and help them change those processes so that they can complete their writing successfully. If we remember that there's no single writing process for all writers and that individuals may change their processes from task to task, then we'll also remember not to substitute that new rigidity about processes for a traditional rigidity about products. Teachers who have adopted process-oriented instruction insist that it improves their students' writing and their attitudes toward writing because it teaches students to use the methods that experienced writers use. Most would agree with Arthur Appleby, who notes that properly implemented process approaches are more effective in fostering good writing and breadth of form, and also in encouraging more reasoned and disciplined thinking about the topics themselves. Finally, they say, process-oriented methods allow them to teach their students workable strategies for completing writing tasks. But despite the attention that the writing process and process-oriented instruction have received over the years, many teachers have not adopted it in their classrooms. They've continued to emphasize the features of the written product in their assignments, in the pre-writing activities they assign or encourage, and in their responses to the writing their students do for them. Some, and I've talked to some of them, even deny that there is such a thing as a writing process or composing processes, and they argue that they see no reason to abandon a simpler, rule-governed approach to writing instruction that stresses the correct use of language and form. In fact, they often argue that process-oriented approaches do not appear to pay adequate attention to final products, that they're too permissive about language and form, and that they allow students to get away with errors that the traditional approach would not tolerate. At the moment, almost any gathering of English teachers, such as the one we're in today, can quickly become a lively discussion, a debate, or even an argument about the writing process and about its value in instruction. I suspect that that's because processes, the writing process itself, its constituent composing processes, have really not been sufficiently explained to many of us, especially some of the researchers have not been sufficiently sensitive to the concerns of those who believe that traditional approaches are more effective. So I think we need to examine some of the assumptions that process-oriented instruction makes and clarify some points that more traditional teachers have difficulty accepting. First, when we say that process-oriented teaching shifts our attention from text to writers and the activities that writers perform when they write, that doesn't mean that we abandon teaching students about rules and conventions. Rather, instead of shifting from an exclusive focus on one to an exclusive focus on the other, we really attempt to include both. We assume that in addition to showing students the formal features that their papers must contain, we need to also give students procedures and activities that will help them generate those papers. Let's look at some of the contrasts, some of the different kinds of statements or questions that the two approaches might have about student writing. A product-oriented approach might simply mark spelling errors, whereas a process-oriented approach would note these errors, but would concentrate on asking how the student went about making those decisions about spelling, or what processes the student used for proofreading, rather than assuming that a student already knows or should know how to proofread or spell. Secondly, product-oriented instruction might say that a paper is underdeveloped or lacks information. A process-oriented response will ask what kinds of invention strategies the student knew about and used in order to gather the information that's in the paper. A product-oriented response might observe that the margins on the paper are too narrow. A process-oriented teacher would wonder about a student's familiarity with written text and whether the student is an effective reader. A product-oriented response would examine paragraphs to see if they contain topic sentences and would look at essays to see if they contain thesis statements. A process approach would ask how the units of a paper came into being and what organizing principles the student might be using, whatever they might be. That is, it would ask not only about results, but about the student's intentions and means of achieving those intentions. Process-oriented instruction recognizes that students must have information if they are to write, so we show them how to gather that information. It recognizes that good writing is organized, and we attempt to provide students with procedures and strategies for organizing. It realizes that experienced writers write multiple drafts, so we provide students with opportunities for writing multiple drafts, and we give them instruction in revision. Introducing process-oriented instruction into a classroom will not necessarily be easy, nor will it automatically solve all of the problems that our students face as beginning writers, or that we face as teachers. But it will solve some of those problems. Perhaps most importantly, it makes students responsible for their own writing. It changes the classroom situation in which we work by placing student activity, that is, students doing composing, rather than instructors lecturing about writing, at the center of the classroom. Finally, it provides students with effective working methods, not simply habits, but effective working methods that they can use to accomplish any writing assignment, at any time in any class. In the next segment, I want to take a specific look at some of the working methods and composing processes and see how we can incorporate them into the classroom. But for now, let's see if we have a few questions. Maybe you weren't ready for questions. I'm going to go ahead and start number 2. If you have questions, go ahead and call them in, and we'll stop and deal with them then. Process activities involve students in doing things in class rather than sitting at their desks and listening to teachers talk about doing things. And it's through these activities that students can do in class that they really learn how to write. They learn what composing processes are, and they learn how to do them. The best way to do that is to begin to get them doing those activities in class so that we can watch them, see what they do, and help them use those processes or composing activities in productive ways rather than in unproductive ways. On pages 7 and 8 of your outline, you'll see a list of various process activities. And I think there's room on that page, or both of those pages, for you to make notes as we work through. It's not really enough to make the assumption that we did early on, that if we simply knew how experienced writers worked, then we would be able to take their activities and transfer them directly into the classroom and say, well, okay, this is how Hemingway worked, so I want my students to do the same thing. Hemingway wrote standing up and often wrote by hand on a board that he had propped on top of his typewriter. I don't think we would necessarily recommend to students that they should do that. But there are some mental activities, some writing activities, some visual activities that will help students do the kinds of writing that they need to do. And we need to ensure that they practice those. Process activities cover the whole range of the writing process and probably begin with finding a subject, which students find to be the most difficult. Many students report is the most difficult part of the process for them. They don't know what to write about, largely because they don't have ideas. They don't think they have ideas. They're not aware that anybody wants to hear their ideas. So some of the process, one of the most productive process activities that we use in class with these students is simple brainstorming. It's probably the most common and popular process activity that we've used over the years. Many of our OSU students come to the university already as skilled, experienced brainstormers. And we find if we can get them started on this, answering specific kinds of questions for themselves. For example, what are you an authority at? What can you teach someone how to do? What would you like to learn how to do? Things of that sort, over time, begin to get students aware that they do have ideas, that they have an expertise in something, and thus that they have something to write about. Another relatively familiar process activity, which will work for gathering ideas and information, it will work for analyzing an audience, it will work for finding a subject, is the journalist method, the questions. And we can go to the overhead here. Journalists have a series of questions that they ask. Who, what, where, when, why, how. That is a very simple but a very powerful method of gathering information, or of what the classical rhetoricians would have called invention. If students can be encouraged to give complete answers to those, not just Joe in answer to who, not just my friend, not just in school, but to actually, in response to these kinds of questions, give full responses, paragraph-length responses. They're going to generate a lot of information about the subject they want to write about. We have a phone call. Yes.
I'm looking at page 6, comparing experienced and inexperienced writers.
Yes.
And it says experienced writers delay producing text until they are ready. And I think you need to say that doesn't really cover free write. May have a confusion about the meaning of the word text there.
Okay, finished text. Finished text, certainly. This is a finding that Nancy Summers came across back in 1979 when she looked at student and experienced writers, and she makes some parallels here with creative artists, especially sculptors, who might spend several months looking at a piece of stone in order to decide exactly what they will do with it. The term that Summers uses is closure, and free writing really doesn't represent closure in the sense that we're willing to throw it away, or much of it away, in order to get a couple of good ideas out of a free writing session. Are you still on the line? No. Okay. I hope I hope I've answered that. Free writing, yes, is text, but it's a particular kind of text in which the writer isn't really invested in coming up with something that is totally finished, totally ready to go to a reader. We have another call. Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. What process do you recommend in teaching your students to proofread the material that they have written?
Okay. I can demonstrate that if we can go to the overhead. What we try to get our students to do, if we could have, there we go. You can't really see the words on my page here, they're too small, but we ask our students to take a page of their text and cover it up with a sheet of paper or a card, and then to read that text backwards. They think we're really strange. They think we're really strange. If
You're getting lots of agreement here.
Okay. Well, something happens when you read backwards. You have to look one word at a time. Your eye pretty much has to focus here, 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 like that. And you can pick up certain kinds of information from that. As you work your way up the page, you have to focus on whether something is a word and whether it is in fact spelled correctly. Now, there are some things you can't pick up. If you have a typo like this, you'll pick it up right away. On the other hand, if you've written there and you meant the other there, then reading backwards won't really help you detect that, because in reading backwards you're going to recognize that they're both words and that they're both properly spelled. So the next thing we do, having read everything backwards, we say, all right, use the same process, start at the top of the page, and this time read it in its normal order. This time you will be able to pick up these differences because you're not able to avoid sensible reading. The reading is making sense to you as you go through it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There is one other thing. What do you think about foot reading? These are high school students reading aloud their papers. So many times they omit words and so forth, which they wouldn't pick up, when you're reading backwards. I think that's very good for spelling and journalistic work, probably. But sometimes in a high school class there are many other errors. And so I'm wondering about the foot reading.
Foot reading isn't a term that I'm really familiar with. Can you help me there?
Well, it's just reading quietly a paper to yourself out loud, and then sometimes switching and having a partner also read the paper to you.
That's an excellent tactic, and it helps. You'll see how good it is if you listen in on those reading groups. A number of researchers are suggesting students working in small groups, sharing their papers out loud with each other. first of all, as part of a revision exercise so that they can check their ideas, get new ideas for writing, and also, if you observe those readings, you'll begin to see the kinds of reading mistakes that students will make. Another thing that you'll see is that students often correct their mistakes as they read aloud. That is, they'll read right through what you believe is an error, and they'll give you the correct version of that word or sentence. It's a fairly well-established procedure in reading studies and miscue analysis, so that, and that gives you some clue that students aren't really making those mistakes as, they're not really making those mistakes as language mistakes. They're having trouble getting that language onto the written page. Is there another call?
Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, we're here.
Here's my question, and it's written by someone else. I'm calling from Gateway Technical College in Kenosha, Wisconsin. What would be a good prompt question which would be used for an assessment of a student's writing? Then, what would be the rubric used to evaluate the writing?
Whoa, that's another teleconference. I'll get your pen ready, and I'll give you a try. A try and an answer. Prompts are very difficult to write. At least I find that they are, because it's very difficult to come up with tasks that students can actually perform well on, and in our case, in about a 90-minute or 2-hour session on a proficiency test. The most helpful resource I have found in answer to that question is a book by Ed White. It's called Teaching and Assessing Writing, published by Jossie Bass in 1985. He goes through the answer to that question in such detail that I would be embarrassed to try it here on the air in the little bit of time that we have for the question. It's an excellent book. It's probably the best $20 I've ever spent, and well worth every penny of it.
Thank you. May I ask another question?
You may.
Okay. What takes the place of a thesis in process writing?
Okay. I don't think anything takes the place of a thesis in process writing. That is, I don't think theses are omitted or are not necessarily part of a student's writing. I think what process advocates are trying to get at here is that the last sentence in the first paragraph of a student essay or paper doesn't necessarily have to be a thesis statement or the thesis statement. That, yes, there has to be a main point, but that main point may be developed over a paragraph or 2 paragraphs, depending upon the length of the whole paper, that it doesn't have to appear in one particular place in the paper. Sometimes writers delay their thesis and actually put it at the end. Sometimes it's more than just one sentence. I don't think anybody's arguing against the thesis statement, but against the rigidity with which they've been treated in the past in where they have to be and how long they have to be, and how they so mechanically, I think, part of the objection, they mechanically set students up for the 5-paragraph essay, which becomes an all-purpose form for the student, but doesn't necessarily always work for their readers.
Okay.
Is that?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, you.
Oh, could I ask one more question based on the first question I asked?
Please.
You recall I asked what would be the rubric used to evaluate the writing. Could you just, in a brief time, specifically state what elements of the writing you would use to evaluate the writing? What would you look at specifically? Spelling, punctuation, grammar?
Okay. If I could have the overhead camera, I think I can probably do this better with pen in hand. If we look at evaluation or scoring, we first of all have to decide what kind of scoring we're going to do. Did I spell that right? Analytic scoring is what we have often done in the past. That is, it decides that we're going to take 2 points off for this or 3 points off for that, Analytic, in fact, a student can go in the hole if you start deducting points for every minor or major error that occurs. The most popular form of scoring that's going on today is holistic scoring, developed by the ETS out of Princeton. Holistic scoring does not look at analytic features such as punctuation or spelling per se. And in effect, you develop the rubric yourself based upon the papers that you read. If you're giving an assessment prompt in class, and you will first of all read those papers, and attempt to rank them. Usually on a scale of 4, 3, 2, 1, or a scale of 6 to 1, depending upon how sophisticated you want it to be. The best paper in the room is a 6, so that using the holistic method, you would find the best paper in the room, and that's a general impression, and using the features of that paper, you would write the description for the 6, so that you would say that a paper that scores a 6, the highest score on this scale, would have features A, B, and C. Its language might be exemplary, although sometimes you might have to draw back from that and say that the student who writes the best paper can have a few mistakes. Once you've decided what kind of scoring system you're going to use, then in either one you can address the criteria that you want to test, and that's something that we need to remember. This kind of scoring or rubric is a criterion referenced scoring as opposed to norm referenced. College entrance tests are norm referenced, and they set people up in a bell curve. Criterion referenced scoring assumes that all students across the board can perform those tasks, can do the tasks that you've set up as part of the writing assignment. So I would, if I were to describe a rubric at this point for Kenosha, Wisconsin, I'd have to be sort of flying in the dark, because I don't know what kind of writing your students are used to doing. I might come up with a rubric that is far too simple for them, or one that is far too complex for them. What we try to do here is read the tests that we have, and decide on the basis of the quality that's there how to write the rubric. What is the best paper in the class? What is the least good paper in the class? And then to complete our rank ordering in that way. I hope I answered that. I don't want to seem like I'm welshing on you, but Ed White really has the best treatment of this subject, and I recommend his book very highly.
Well, I thank you. I think you did a fine job.
Thank you. Should we go from here? Somebody mentioned free writing. Let's talk about free writing for a minute. Free writing is an excellent way of helping students generate lots of ideas and information in a very short time, and it accomplishes at the same time the very desirable goal of getting them to write without worrying about mistakes, without worrying about language, but simply producing a great many ideas in a very short period of time. They won't use all of those. The rules are fairly simple. Students write for a timed period, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 10 minutes. I often find that 5 to 10 is more than enough, especially for new writers. They don't have to write fast. They simply have to write steadily. As they write, they have to observe 2 rules. First, they can't lift their pen from the page. They can't stop and they can't go back in order to correct anything that they've missed. Do we have a call? Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a question about teaching mechanics.
Okay.
Many people who propose the process approach say that mechanics, grammar, sentence structure, usage, should be taught within the writing process. And I can see that this can happen to a point, but don't students, particularly more sophisticated writers, need a common vocabulary in advance of the writing process so that basic mechanical usage issues can be even discussed? For instance, don't they need some drill work, some basic grammar study before they can even talk about writing?
I think I want to
just see what your response would be.
Okay, I think I want to separate the question into a couple of parts. Sophisticated writers, yes, do need what Joseph Williams calls powerful generalizations about language in order to be able to talk about language. It's difficult to talk about sentence structure or other things unless we have a common vocabulary, and students don't often have that vocabulary in common with us. So I would agree with that. But what we've discovered is that our students do learn in process, that without that vocabulary, in fact, sometimes we don't even circle things. We simply indicate that in this line there's something you need to pay attention to. That the more they write, the more likely they are to clean up the kinds of mechanical problems and errors that we wish they would stop making. Sometimes you can develop a vocabulary with students that will serve to replace the one that we've been using for years. In her book, Errors and Expectations, in 1977, Mina Shaughnessy shows an extensive exercise in showing students how, in this case basic writing students, how to master the difference between plural S and possessive S. And the whole lesson is based on what she calls red S and green S. So she really isn't giving them a sophisticated grammatical terminology so much as she is calling their attention to certain features and then working specifically on those features. Now, we're gonna look at error and usage and drill a little later. I myself don't have students do a lot of drill and find that ultimately it really isn't very necessary for our students. Are you still on the line? Okay. I think we were talking about free writing. The purpose of free writing is to get students to shut down their editor and write, produce, learn that they can be confident and productive with language without having to stop at every word or half sentence and worry about whether they got something right. There are some rules for teachers when it comes to free writing as well. One of them is that teachers aren't allowed to read free writing unless the student says that we can. And the only comments we're permitted to make, if we're using Peter Elbow's original rules, the only comments we're permitted to make about free writing is thank you. So that we've encouraged them to turn their evaluative thinking processes off while they write. And our deal with them is that we won't then turn our evaluators on if and when we read what they write. Students are able to go back into free writing segments and pick up a number of ideas which they can in turn make the basis or core of the next free writing session or of a subsequent draft. Sometimes free writing produces text. Sometimes we don't want to produce text. We want to go to visual activities because some of our students think visually. If we could go with the overhead camera, I want to talk about a process that a number of textbooks have introduced called mapping. It's really not geography, but it's a way of working with visual impressions. If we were to start here in the center and just put what we want to write about, let's say today it's teaching, what we're going to do is produce a series of rays out from that center. Call a teacher a coach, call a teacher a judge, call a teacher a friend, call a teacher a helper. What is it that a coach does, or a teacher does as a coach? Gives advice, probably gives support. Whereas over here we evaluate, we give grades. We're beginning here to develop clusters, or a map, if you will, of teaching in a highly visual way that doesn't depend upon producing continuous text, as it's kind of free associational in that whenever we think of something, we simply look on the map to find a place to connect it. What kinds of support do we give? We give instruction, but we also may give emotional support. The map, and I usually do mine on very large pieces of paper rather than the small one that's here, the map eventually begins to show repetitions. It begins to show centers of gravity, if we could call them that, things that will indicate to students what they're interested in. And as you look at a map that a student has made, you'll discover just how much information students are able to contain and produce about subjects that they know about. Some of the other things that we have found productive, if we can look at the overhead again, this works for generating information, but it at the same time is an organizing technique. Linda Flower, some years ago, introduced what she calls issue trees. Some people call them information trees. Some people draw them with the trunk at the bottom. I like my trees upside down, like organizational charts. And I'll put my subject right up there at the top. And initially, at least, as I'm using this to generate information, I'll break writing into 2 segments. In this case, maybe pre-writing and writing. Well, what do I do as I pre-write? I do think about my audience. I do need a subject. I do need to organize. I do need information. And right here you see something that gives the issue tree an advantage over the outline. Right there, if you look back at the linear stage model, or if you just look at this from a common sense point of view, it's tough to organize something before you have it. So obviously I'm going to want to get my information first and organize it second. But the issue tree doesn't really care. The issue tree will let me put things down, much as a map does, in the order that I think of them. They're sort of organized by major concepts and sub-concepts, but issue trees say nothing about sequence. Later on, after you've gotten the ideas out, after you have grouped your ideas into 2 or 3 or 4 large categories, then you can worry about sequence. Then it may be time for the outline. Then we can do the major outline, pre-writing. But if we try to do this first, if we try to get this outline first, this outline cares very much whether I got things in the wrong sequence. If I get number 2 and should be at number 3, I get something at 3 that should be at 2, my outline's going to be out of sequence. So the outline asks me to make 2 kinds of decisions, relationship and sequence, at the same time. Whereas the issue tree simply asks me basically to work with relationship. It says that these 2 ideas are both related to that first idea in the same way. And it says that they're related to each other because they're the same order of importance. It says that everything that I've put down here is related in some way to that subconcept and related to each other by being on the same line, relatively the same degree of importance. So I'm making decisions about relationships as though I were sorting things into piles, but I'm not making decisions about sequence yet. I can do that later. Some students find it easy to only have to worry about one of those processes at a time. Later on, when it becomes time to draft a paper, there are a number of things that students can use our help with. Students don't understand that they don't have to start in line 1 and write to the last line and get everything absolutely right in that order and not be able to move on to one line until they get the first line correct. So we can help them by giving them different kinds of things to do, having them write drafts very quickly in class, and then allowing them to revise those drafts. Having them break their papers down into segments, writing introductions, writing conclusions, sometimes asking students to write 3 separate and different examples. Most textbooks carry a section on example. Then students will begin to see how those examples can be laced together into a single paper. Then we can write an introduction. Then we can write a conclusion. I often have students write multiple introductions. I'll say write 3 introductions, don't look at the first 2. At the first when you write the second, don't look at the first 2 when you write the third. And then we'll turn to conclusions. Write 3 conclusions for your paper. Don't look at the first one when you write the second one. Don't look at the first 2 when you write the third one. And then we can compare them with the original introduction and conclusions that were in their drafts. And often, students will discover that in each of these 3 or 4 introductions that they write, there'll be something that they can use. So their final paper winds up being a collection of things taken from one or the other of those test runs. But the test runs have been just that. What we've done is to break this large writing process, this large task of doing a paper, down into small, short, finite elements that students can master, rather than leaving them with a huge task to do all at once. Students sometimes resist these kinds of activities. They say that this doesn't work. They can't do it. It takes too much time. Students are very comfortable with the composing processes that they've developed over the years. They've discovered that they can wait till the last minute, write the paper the night before it's due, drop it on our desks, and of course we'll edit it for them. We'll put all those marks on it and show them where all the problems are. I think we have to answer their objections calmly and carefully and reassuringly, but at the same time we have to insist that they stay with composing processes in order to learn how they work, to learn that writing does take time, to learn that they can do it, and to learn that if they stay with it, they will ultimately be more successful than if they abandon it. When they say they can't do something, many times my students are reacting to their own anxiety, saying that they're afraid they're going to get it wrong. They're used to making mistakes. They may be impatient with activities that for the moment they don't see have any purpose. But if I can reassure them and sometimes show them how a particular composing activity is going to help them get closer to a finished draft, then they'll go along with me. Sometimes they look up from their work and they say, am I doing this right? And it's often, that remark often stuns me. It's very difficult to brainstorm or free write wrong. We've trained them very well over the years to do things in precise, careful ways, to put their name on the page in a particular position, to fold the paper in a particular way, to make an outline out according to the example in the book. And what they're doing when they ask that question is following their training. What we need to do is shake them up a little bit and suggest that they take a chance, that they engage in language as play, fooling around with their papers, looking for interesting ideas, rather than worrying about getting things right the first time. There'll be time later to get things right. And at the same time, we need to remember that there's no right way to do these particular composing processes. I think time suggests that we need to move on to to the third segment, where I do want to address something that came up in an earlier question about error. Just what do we know about student errors? Students make mistakes. We seem to be surprised by that. We shouldn't really be surprised by that because they're learning. What really separates students from experienced writers in this respect is that students allow their mistakes, their writing mistakes, to persist into their final drafts, and we hope that experienced writers don't do that. They've learned something about how to find those errors before they get into a final copy. We make a lot of assumptions when we come to errors. We assume that students make mistakes because they don't know the rules, and therefore it's our job to teach them the rules. So what we really need to do is give them a dose of a grammar handbook, and we'll do some drill and practice, and maybe that will work. Sometimes students take the message, though, that it's those things that we are primarily interested in rather than their ideas, and they retreat into a correct but rather empty kind of writing. Students assume different things about language than we do. Students assume that they will make mistakes. They assume that they will make mistakes, but nobody else will. Most adolescents assume that they're unique, and writers, real writers, according to students, write without mistakes. I have yet to meet a real writer who does that, but many students believe that that's how it happens. Students expect that they should be able to produce error-free writing on demand, and they'll often tell me that their only writing problem is grammar, and would I please give them more instruction in grammar. As a profession, we've tried to deal with error in a number of ways. We've tried direct instruction in grammar. We've used workbooks, we've used class time, we've used drills, we've used fill-in-the-blanks. We've discovered, I think, over the years that it doesn't always work because students are making the same mistakes in the 5th grade that they made in the 3rd, the same in the 9th that they made in the 5th, the same in college that they made in the 11th. Some scholars have even suggested that all of those workbooks, by showing students wrong examples, have given them more ways of making mistakes with language than they would have discovered on their own. Another thing that we've done is to respond to those errors in a particular way when we read student writing. I do have a graphic for this. If we can get it up on the screen, you probably can't read it at 12 to 15 feet away from the screen, but my point here is that we should look at the overall visual impression that this particular mark makes. If we look, that's the top half of the first page of a student paper. If we drop to the bottom half, what students see in that kind of response is the overwhelming presence of red ink. It just sort of scares away all of the ink that they put on the page. A couple of things happen when we do this. We have in mind, when we mark those papers, a kind of hierarchy. These mistakes are more important than these mistakes, which are more important in turn than these little tiny mistakes. Students don't see that hierarchy. They see red ink. They see red ink all over that page, and they say, where do I start? What will I do here? Something else happens, sort of an unintended effect, is that we've cut the end of their writing process off. Instead of forcing them, insisting that they be editors, that they be responsible for their writing, what we've done is take over that editing function for them. We found it all, and they know we will, and they know we will every time, so they've stopped bothering with that. A third recent method of reacting to errors has been to ignore them. Lots of people are saying that what students really need to do is practice writing, extensive practice with language, and that they make mistakes because they don't have a lot of experience writing, and what we'll do is we'll just ignore those mistakes and they'll go away. That's called the romantic notion. We have a call.
Yes, this is Charles Lopez calling from the Regional Staff Development Center and Gateway Technical College in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I have actually two questions, but the first one is rather simple. You mentioned cubing on page 7 under number 1B. The folks here in Kenosha would like to know...
Like to know what that is?
Yeah, what is cubing?
Okay. My source is a book by Elizabeth Neal called Writing. It's a freshman level textbook. If we could go to the overhead so you can see what happens here. She says that what we can do is help students get different perspectives on a writing subject if we think of what we're doing as a cube. So the cube has 6 sides. What we're going to do is 6 different operations. We're going to write a paragraph, probably spend 5 minutes, no more, on each side of that cube. We're going to start by describing, and these are her terms. First, describe. Second, compare. Third, associate. Freshmen have trouble with that sometimes in college. We have to help them figure out what associate means, but they like to do it once they discover it. Analyze. Break it down into its parts. Apply it. What's it good for? What can you use it for? Argue for it or against it. I've discovered that sitting at the keyboard, I can produce about 6 single-spaced pages in the 30 minutes allotted to a complete cubing sequence like this. I suspect, now that's my rate, I suspect most high school or college freshmen won't produce that much, but in that 30-minute period, they will discover that they produce a great many ideas and illustrations and details that they can incorporate then into drafts later on. And they'll also discover, since they're shifting around, they're shifting from one perspective to another, always trying to look at this problem from a new direction, they're going to discover new ideas. They get new ways of looking at the subject that they're writing about. I'm sort of an enthusiast of cubing. Are we still on the line?
Yep.
Does that help?
I believe it does.
The title of her book is Writing, and it's Scott Forsman, 85. Elizabeth Cowan Neal.
Okay, I have another question.
Go ahead, please.
You mentioned earlier a process where you use or have the students write multiple introductions.
I do.
And multiple conclusions.
Right.
Can you give us some examples of this, please, and indicate how much time or how much class time do you spend on the process?
I may spend the whole class on 3 introductions. Students will have brought drafts in class with them, and we may spend a 50-minute class just doing that because I want to be sure that they're doing it. I want to be able to observe that writing behavior while they're writing. I want to be able to look at the introductions as they're being developed. So we do it right in class. They'll usually come up with 3 paragraph-length segments, and then what I try to do is meet very briefly during that class with every student in the room, 25, and we try to look at where those introductions correspond with each other, where they differ from each other, where they go off on wild tangents, in order to try to come up with another introduction, another direction to go at the end of that. So we spend a lot of class time on those kinds of things.
What about examples?
Of student writing, I don't have any on the desk here.
No. Examples of multiple introductions and conclusions.
I'm not computing that somehow.
Okay, well, I'm reading a question that someone else has written. Maybe we'll get back to you.
Usually my students write a very weak introduction. They'll start off, they'll say, there are, there's a weak verb anyway, 3 kinds of men at OSU. Well, I'll look at the way that student has set things up. We're going to have 3 paragraphs, okay? We're going to have athletes, we're going to have nerds, and then we're going to have a third category, and then we're going to have a conclusion. Sometimes that conclusion is the most highly developed piece of the paper. What I want the student to do is get away from this, which is really sort of mindless, and I want them to make a strong statement about this subject down here, something that may in fact bounce them out of those 3 categories, may in fact make them see that those are 3 rather artificial categories, that you don't have to break everything into 3s. What do you really want to say about men at OSU? If you are one of them, what do you think? If you're dating them, what are you thinking about them? What's your point here? And by forcing them time and time again into the page, forcing them to do a new introduction and saying, give me more, give me more, give me information, they eventually stretch themselves out to a page or 2 pages of introduction and actually say something positive, something very strong about their subject, and at the same time destroy the possibility that they can do the 5-paragraph essay and the sort of 1, 2, 3, and I've got you and I'm finished and aren't we both glad, which I hate to read and they hate to write. You still there?
Yeah.
Is that making any sense?
It is to me.
Okay.
All right. I want to thank you. And the folks here in Racine and Kenosha may be calling you back.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Another call. All right, let's do one more, and then we're going to move into the 3rd segment.
Yes, Frank Cady, the principal at Wellsville High School in Wellsville, New York. And I want to go back to your activities that produce text.
Right.
You list free writing and journal writing as 2 separate entities. And we do a lot of journal writing, and yet we consider that a free writing exercise. Could you explain why, how you feel, etc. on that?
Okay. Free writing, as I use it, is timed. We usually have students work in 5 or 10-minute segments. We don't let them go back to cross anything out. We don't let them stop to think of what's coming next. Journal writing, as we use it, comes more in line with what Donald Murray calls using a day book. We encourage students in those journals to put almost everything that's connected with the writing that they're doing. Any kind of list, brainstorming lists, those multiple introductions I've been talking about, those multiple conclusions, you name it, and it's in that journal. We tend to discourage students from using the journal as a diary. We learned some years ago that if we let them do diaries, 2 things happen. They're boring and they tell us things we don't want to know. So we tend to stay away from the diary approach. The journal is a place where a student can be expressive, free in that sense, pretty much without penalty. And we're finding that many, many times some of their strongest writing is in that journal, is in the writing they're doing for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's the way we look at journal writing too. Students have a tendency to relate all their activities. Do you have time for one more question?
One more short one. Go ahead, please.
Yes. We are actually a group of teachers from several districts here calling from Olean, New York. One question I have is, with the advent of the word processor, which is allowing people to edit more quickly and sometimes eliminating draft copies, how does this impact on your opinions of student writing in the context of correcting student errors and having draft copies with which they can relate to their finished copy?
Ooh, big question. If they have computers readily accessible, the computer allows them to produce revisions very quickly and very often. If they don't have computers readily accessible, then it becomes a real drill for the teacher to keep moving people in and out of the terminal or the keyboard so that they can make those corrections. Some people object to spell checkers and things of that sort, they don't bother me. If a student can get hold of a spell checker and will use it, that's fine, because the rest of the business world is doing that as well. The object is to produce clean text, not to necessarily have to do it all by yourself. Spelling is not an intellectual skill, it's a mechanical skill.
Do you consider it overall a benefit for the writing process or detriment?
I don't know. I think sometimes they get in the way with inexperienced writers who are spending a lot of time trying to get used to the computer and the keyboard and the word processing program, and they'll say they don't know how to type. I find that for me they're highly efficient. They have increased my productivity 400% or 500%, and that I can virtually not compose without one anymore. I like them. I love them. I find sometimes you have to slow down and back off your workload in a course. You have to back off how much you think you're going to get accomplished if you're going to use computers, and actually spend more time on fewer assignments, and you can get more intense with that. If you give each student in each assignment more intense instruction, if you're set up for it. If you're not set up for it, it's a nightmare. And I've lived that particular nightmare.
Thank you very much.
No more calls? Okay. We're going to do a real short version of the third segment on error analysis. Error analysis is something that was developed in teaching of English as a second language, and it has basically the following premises. It says, let's look at errors and find out where they came from. That is, error analysis, and there's a graphic for this if we can get it up on the screen. Error analysis basically asks two questions. It says, is this particular feature a deviation from the language code we want a student to achieve? And secondly, in what structure is this an error? Now, we can go beyond that and ask if it's an error, and we know what structure it's an error in, where did it come from? And that is one of the most productive things about error analysis, is that it gives us a new framework. Rather than simply saying something is wrong, we begin to think analytically about what students are doing. You have a copy of a student paper, and it shows, I think, a total of 35 or 36 marked or numbered errors. I want to take a particular look at the sheets you have marked errors grouped by type. And notice that of the 36 errors that we have in this paper, 8 of those, or something over 25%, are in fact punctuation errors. All of those involve commas, and 2 of those are adding where they don't belong. There's one comma splice, which we'll call punctuation, at least for the time being. Now, if we think about these commas in the context of the instruction that was being given in this particular class, we will discover that the extra commas here almost all appear before words that the student seems to have made into coordinating conjunctions. She had been taught during the week before this paper was written about putting a comma between 2 independent clauses joined with a coordinating conjunction. She's overgeneralizing the rule. If we can, instead of simply teaching her the rule again or giving her additional drill on the rule, what we really want to do with this student is not to reinforce her overgeneralization so much as to help her distinguish between coordinating conjunctions and other kinds of words that she might think are serving that function. 12, or a third of those errors in this paper, are spelling errors. And in some cases, they're spelled correctly elsewhere. For example, dresser is misspelled the same way twice. We'll only count that once. Some of them are instances of spelling by sound, such as permanent. Some of them are dialect interference. Error number 22 is the new had worn off, is a fairly common dialect feature in this region of the United States. This student, however, can spell some rather sophisticated words. missed one of them. She makes fairly common errors, like a lot, as one word. Those aren't really serious. We can reduce or almost ignore at this point fully a third of the errors that she has. 3 of them are with verbs. She seems to get wrong verb forms. She seems to have trouble with subject-verb agreement. The most pressing errors in this particular paper are the sentence fragments. If we take spelling, punctuation, and sentence fragments together, those 3 categories comprise, let me get my number right, 28 out of 36 errors that this particular student makes. Spelling's probably lowest and least troublesome. She can spell heirloom after all. Punctuation is probably a bigger problem, but it's not really getting in our way. We can read this paper fairly well. We see, though, that the sentence fragments begin to interfere with readability. Maybe instead of marking all of those errors that we saw marked earlier on her particular paper with the red ink, maybe what we need to do is focus on these particular sentence fragments. They're the things that are interfering with our readability and getting in her way. She's not communicating with us. She's having difficulty identifying sentences and sentence boundaries, and we want to be able to help her with that. The unintentional sentence fragments are the most intrusive. If we can look at number 13, though, where I think we have a graphic for this, when I've removed her original punctuation and underlined the original fragment, we find that she's writing a sentence. When I first got my dresser, it was more of a toy. Well, now there's an incomplete comparison in there, but we see that she's handling English syntax. In fact, in number 27, we're seeing that she's handling English syntax even in a more sophisticated way. The dresser was important to Mama because of Mr. Tillman, but when Daddy died in 1967, the value of the dresser became priceless to me and to Mama as well. That's an English sentence. It may not be the best English sentence in the world, but it is an English sentence. The fragments seem to cluster on page 2, in the paragraphs where the student is shifting from describing the dresser to explaining why she values it, why it is important to her. And I think the clustering on that page of sentence fragments is really no accident. She's in a part of the paper in which she's having the most trouble giving her ideas adequate development and continuity. We're getting flashes of ideas between short circuits of syntax, almost as though her thoughts are moving faster than she can record them. For example, at number 29, she writes, "The dresser keeps alive in my thoughts the relationship I shared with Daddy, and because Mama found her own special connection in the story, makes it even more precious." This is torture. This doesn't really work. But rather than attempt to correct the syntax, perhaps what we need to do with this student is work with her development of ideas. This particular error is an opportunity for us to work with her with revision and sentence structure in order to get her to tell us what she's saying here, to ask her to explain this at some length, maybe even tape record it. If she can get the meaning straight, she will, the syntax, the sentence structure is in some ways going to follow it. The same observation is true of the next fragment, number 33. I grew up around understanding, compassionate people, of which I usually wish I had more of, as I stuff it under my arm as I go out the door. Well, that's a tortured sentence too, but if you will look back at the first paragraph, we see that this writer is attempting, only partially successfully, to connect the end of the paper with the beginning. There she pictures herself walking out the door as she leaves her husband. One of the things I stick under my arm as I go out the door is a miniature dresser. Rather than focus on this particular fragment as a mistake, I think it would be more productive for us as teachers to help her complete the connection she's attempting to make here. I think maybe this responds in some ways to an earlier question we had about, do errors take care of themselves in process, or do we need to give drill? This is not a student, and this is an exemplary, a pretty good example of a basic writing student here at OSU. This student doesn't need more drill. Her writing has continued to improve because she's continued to write and develop. Because we didn't give her drill, because we encouraged her to figure out what she was saying, to express that meaning carefully and thoroughly. She's now able to avoid sentence fragments and move beyond the problem of sentence recognition into getting her ideas out. We are very close to being out of time. I want to thank you for your excellent questions this afternoon. I think I enjoyed answering them almost more than I enjoyed doing the parts that I'd prepared. You indicate by the questions that you're a well-prepared and interested group of teachers. I've enjoyed being with you, and I hope you found it somewhat useful.